Hello, my name is Stan Holmes. I'm a PhD in economics at Texas A&M College of Business. That's Texas A&M Commerce, that is. And what I'd like to do today is talk to you about forecasting for rural, small and mid-sized businesses. And this presentation is sponsored by USDA, by the way. And what it's aimed at is trying to improve the capabilities of small businesses to enjoy some of the same resource capabilities that larger companies have. That is, that small businesses have got the right to use some of the same instruments and applications that are available to larger firms. And what I intend to do today is give you some instruction on how to use an advanced forecasting technique for your company. And the company could be a small farm, hardware store, restaurant, any small business or rurally located business, up to a mid-sized business that hires 90 to 100 people or so and needs forecasts for determining resource requirements and manpower requirements. So what we're going to do is talk about how to specifically forecast revenues for companies, that is, forecast companies' revenue performance. Because my 36 years in the corporate world, besides growing up in a family that ran small businesses, have demonstrated that you need a forecast in order to anticipate what's happening, what could happen to you in the future relative to resource requirements. All businesses are affected by recessions and expansionary periods in the general economy and other instances, and all businesses have their own characteristics relative to seasonality and how they respond to those cycle influences that I was just mentioning, expansionary and contractionary economic conditions. So all businesses are different. And what I'm going to do is show you a way that you can forecast for a small business, and it incorporates the difference that you may have within your business versus another business. Now, I mentioned to you that I've been an executive in the real world, so to speak, large corporations, high tech, and it's hardware, software environments, markets. And I've been in sales, marketing, and planning and at executive levels in 3 Fortune 500 companies. So what I'm giving you today is a presentation on how to forecast that is just as good, just as capable as the forecast methods that they use in those companies, because I've seen them before. They've used them. I've been responsible for them. What we're going to do today also is take advantage of some basic skills in Excel. Excel is part of the Microsoft Office package, and you can find it if you go to this website if you're not familiar with it already. Most small business users typically have Excel and or QuickBooks or some other program that you can extract information in Excel in. And what we're going to talk about is how to label data in Excel, how to enter time series data. And the time series data we're going to be focused on entering in a column is your firm's revenue, your company's revenue. And we're going to learn how to copy and paste functions relative to numbers. And that is convert numbers via functional cell functionality copies. And then we're going to show you how to invert a data column and apply some math functions to those columns. That is multiplying one column by another and doing those sorts of things, and creating an index or counter for the data series, show you how to do that, and show you how to graph data columns. That's pretty easily done in Excel. As I mentioned to you, we're going to focus on sales revenue forecasts. And the revenue forecast in small, medium, and large companies, large corporations, are required because they really are kind of the basic business driver. People say, well, if we use expense levels, we can forecast our revenue. I'm afraid that's the wrong way to look at things. You need to really look at the key driver for expense levels, and that happens to be revenues. You can anticipate what they are and increase expense levels, but that means you have to have a forecast of revenues, don't you, if you anticipate them. So what we're going to do is look at revenues from the standpoint of how it basically drives a business, how it shows how the company's operating. It's really a good measure of company's performance, and it reflects all the major business decisions that are made in the company. You know, if you decide to acquire another company or acquire another truck, for instance, in a small company, or you want to acquire another herd of cattle, for instance, for your company, anticipated revenue from that those expenses are the driving factor of why you're making those decisions. So we want to provide incentive for sales and production or service employees. That's what we're trying to do with the forecast. You're setting a requirement for the company's operational capabilities, and it provides an incentive for sales. That's how sales quotas are established for larger firms. What they do is they look at the forecast sales that they need in order to participate in company growth, and they set the sales quotas to achieve it. So that those estimates of revenue are really the driver for the sales side of the house. And on the production side, and a small business, sales and production decisions are made by the same person, of course, in a lot of instances. The production side of the house, you determine the number of tracked farm equipment, how much farm equipment you need. You determine the number of trucks you need, determine the number of machines you need in order to produce the sales required moving forward. So all of those forecasts really give you the incentive or give you the indication of whether you need to expand resources for the company. And like I said, it applies to small, medium-sized business and large business as well. They all use the same basic process. So if you want to raise funds for the company, a good forecast is a way to demonstrate that you've got a bright future for the company and it's easier to raise funds. So the forecasts are usually used to demonstrate the company's capability to raise or pay off loans going forward and raise funds. And it's used to establish a baseline for capital planning and expense planning and headcount human resource planning for your company. And what we want to do is remember the old adage in economics, since I happen to be a professor of economics, is that all decisions are made on the margin. That is, they're made relative to change. If you didn't have a business that wasn't going to change or didn't expect to change, there are not too many decisions to be made going forward. But if you have to replace equipment or add equipment or you expect some growth, that anticipation, that change that's shown by the forecast really drives the decisions that you're going to make and tell you what you need in order to achieve success in the company. So one of the first things you need to do is get to know the data, know your company, and look at the horizon you need for the forecast for future periods. I typically use a 2-year forecast for planning. That's what we've used in the corporate world. Some companies plan 5 years. but the accurate forecast horizon is typically around 2 years. And so what we need to do is acquire the company's sales information, your company's sales information, for at least 1 to 2 years. And what I'd like to have it broken down to in terms of expressing the seasonal effects is either have quarterly or monthly data. Now, if you've got monthly data, you can simply sum the months for revenues, and it becomes quarterly. Sums the 3 months, of course, will create a quarterly number. Like some January, February, and March gives you the first quarter revenue for your company. And what we're going to do is run a simple time series plot on the company's revenue once we've got it entered in a column, starting with the oldest revenue at the top of the column and the most recent revenue at the bottom of the column. So we'll just work our way down a column in terms of company's performance, revenue performance, historical revenue performance. And we'll plot the revenue. And you can expect that plot that you get for your company's revenue for long-term growth. That's called trend. It's sometimes called secular growth or long-term growth. It's really the slope of the trend line for the revenue. And it gives you some idea of what the expectations are for the company in terms of monthly or quarterly performance. And we're going to look at the plot of the company's revenue from the standpoint of cycle effects. That is, how business conditions change over time due to underlying economic conditions. And how it affects your company's revenue. It looks like a roller coaster. It's a multi-year effect. It takes maybe 3, 4, maybe 5 to 9 years to complete a complete cycle. This last downturn that we had, the Great Recession as it's called, it began in the last half of 2007, was the effects were still being felt through 2015, 2016, until we finally pulled ourselves up in terms of aggregate economic performance. So that's a long cycle period that we went through relative to that Great Recession. So those cycles vary in amplitude, that is how deep they can get, recessions, expansions, and how long, what the periodicity is. You know they're going to be greater than a year. We're also going to inspect the plots of revenue for annually recurring seasonal effects, and that's why we want to use either monthly or quarterly. And I'm going to tell you a story about the use of quarterly versus monthly data. I mentioned to you I was in a family that ran small businesses. My father ran a truck stop back in the East Coast at one time, and it was a large truck stop. It had quite a revenue generation capability, and he used to run the truck stop on actually monthly basis in terms of monthly performance levels. And my father found that his adjustments, he was always worried about the adjustments that he had to make and made in terms of either hiring people, letting people go, not buying equipment or buying equipment. And we have a professional accounting firm outside of Washington, D.C. that did our accounting for us. And they told my father, he said, it's better for you not to interfere in the company as much as you have been. That is, his monthly decisions were actually perturbing or reacting to company, the revenue signs too quickly. So he had to pay for a downturn that he actually created, and in terms of some of the decisions he made. That is, he cut back resources when he saw a sign of a downturn, and actually with that cut back in resource actually affected his capability to deliver sales for the next period. So they said that he should shift his focus from monthly inspection of information to quarterly information inspection. That is, look at the performance over the quarter. And sure enough, his signs of stress went away tremendously when he looked at the data on a quarterly basis. He didn't have as many decision points to make during the year, and those decision points didn't perturb the business and create problems for him for himself. So in actuality, he expanded that one truck stop after he went to quarterly accounting to 2 more truck stops that were very successful as well. So what I'm saying to you is that too much intervention. I know we have something called NetSuite by Oracle, the old company I used to work for. It gives you real-time information. That's good and that's bad, because if you make major decisions relative to the resource allocations on a single, for instance, purchase of your service or not purchase of it, then you could be damaging your future. And I think that jerking the company around with too much information quickly is good for long-term growth. And that's what we're going to focus on here in this presentation. Here's an example of a company. This is Walmart, actually. I'm not picking on the company, but this is publicly available information from the Walmart's SEC, Security and Exchange Commission filings, the 10-K reports that they have to file with the FCC. They're publicly available. And you can see that there is a long-term trend. They have a positive trend, a growth rate, and we can look at that trend if we ran a trend line on this company's data. And in addition to that, we have seasonality. You can see the seasonal effects, see the little peaks that are occurring every 4 periods. This is quarterly data, by the way, quarterly revenue for Walmart. And this is what they use to make their decisions on in the company. But you can see the seasonality effects with the seasonal peaks. Okay, they recur every year. Okay, and what we're going to do is look at a forecast method that'll try to capture the trend, or not try to, but we'll capture the trend of the company, and it'll capture this seasonality that we're looking at. Okay, these seasonal peaks. So in order to have a realistic forecast, you have to put those components in the forecast itself. There's something else that's occurring too. If you'll notice, there's kind of a change in growth rate over time. It grows up, then there's a hitch down. This happened to be the Great Recession. Okay, then it's a growth back up, and then kind of a flattening of the growth period. So that is called cycle. Whenever you have a change in the general growth rate of the revenue series or any economic series, it's called a cycle effect. So the general economic conditions cause this downturn that we see here. This downturn in revenue. That's the 2007 to 2011, the recession that we saw. Okay, so we need to incorporate how Walmart reacted to, or your firm reacts to, a downturn in the economy or an upturn, a growth period in the economy, and kind of a stable economic condition. We need to know how your firm reacts to those types of situations in order to create a good forecast. So our forecast is going to include trend, long-term trend growth, seasonality, the seasonal effect, it recurs every year, and the cycle pattern. We're going to look at how the growth of the company changes during changing economic conditions. Here's another. This is Best Buy. You can tell it's got some tremendous increase in seasonality. Changing growth rates, growing fairly rapidly during this period, this uptick period, and it leveled off. And then you had the Great Recession hitting this company, and it actually changed the way the company operated. You notice that their seasonality grew, and that's good and bad for a company, because it's hard for a company to address with tremendous seasonal effects, because they have to hire resources and then let them go in order to fine-tune the company. So you have to have either an upstream supply chain process that enables delivery of inventory on a specific time when you have high growth, like the seasonal effects are indicating here, and you have to cut the inventory levels off immediately after that in order to achieve economic stability, financial stability for the company when the high quarter goes away. But then you notice the cycle effect didn't continue after the recession. They have a flat period of growth, in fact, kind of negative growth since then, but they're still suffering from very high seasonality, which requires a lot of cost to make adjustments to the company, a lot of internal cost in terms of getting the appropriate supplies or inventory and having the appropriate amount of resources on hand. So this is a much more difficult scenario to manage going forward than a high growth scenario with lower seasonality. Okay, so this has got a strong cycle effect. You can see it's got trend, but the trend has been slightly pulled down because of this flat period over here. So we can't say it's got a really high growth rate relative to long-term performance, but it does have seasonality, strong seasonality, and it does have a change in growth rate pattern over the time, and in the recessionary reaction and non-recovery basically since then. So this has got strong cycle in it, where this Walmart revenue doesn't show such strong cycle. Okay, so there are many canned software packages that can do the job of capturing trend, cycle, and seasonality. One's Demands Work, Sales Forecast, Cron, Agile, SAS, Stata, Minitab, which we use here at Texas A&M Commerce and the College of Business, and a lot of other packages. But what we're going to do is use Excel. So we can see, this is what you need to ask if you're going to make a decision on any of these forecasting packages. Ask if they can easily forecast company revenue characteristics, trend, cycle, and seasonality. Can they capture those effects, the T, C, and S effect, easily? Can they do deep analysis of trend, cycle, and seasonal effects? Okay, so you have to make sure that the packages are easy to use, low cost, and we're going to use one of the lower cost packages, and that's Microsoft Excel to do the forecasting for us. So you need to realize that the causation that we're going to examine flows from the sales revenue. Okay, your decisions relative to managing the business result in sales revenue. And don't think that the causation flows from expense levels. And that is called the field of dreams approach, or assumption that if you spend the money, you're going to get the revenue. That's not necessarily the case. And all my exposure to executive committees, you do not go in with an investment, the standalone investment, with a question mark relative to what it's going to generate. You always have to have a revenue forecast in order to justify an investment. That is, you got to look at the rate of return. So make sure you get the cause and effect. So the cause is actually the revenue that we expect, and the effect would be the investment in revenue performance. Historical sales reflect management decisions and performance in the past. We mentioned, let me go back to this. Management made decisions in this diagram. They made the decision to not advertise perhaps as much for non-seasonal peaks. They made the decision here to probably cut resources tremendously, and they made a decision here relative to the flat growth of the company. So this is management's decision making that's occurring here. It's whether or not they can compete in the marketplace with companies like Amazon and some other competitors that come into play. This is their decision, and this is what they reaped from the decision that they made. Just keep that in mind, that historical sales, past performance, reflect those management decisions. Okay, so what you need to do in your company is create this baseline forecast that reflects a business as usual scenario. That is, I'm not going to create a forecast for you that's incorporating some new programs that you may have you put in place. What you need to do is take the sales forecast that we'll produce, this business as usual forecast, and then add the programs to it later if you feel that they're necessary. Like you can buy new trucks or buy a new herd of cattle if you're farming, buy new store displays, for instance, if you're running a hardware store. You can make those decisions going forward, but they're not going to be included in the baseline forecast, because what we're going to do is create something called a pro forma forecast. That is a business as usual forecast going forward. And so what you need to do is look at this kind of conservative business as usual view and then make decisions that will generally influence sales. And you can do that on an add-on basis going forward. So what we're going to do is look at the window revenue or window that revenue creates for us relative to your company's performance, and it drives these other things. And I told you about the quarterly focus prevents over-controlling or over-intervention. In some cases, too many decisions are not good. Too many programs are not good. Keep yourself focused on long-term growth. That's my recommendation. So quarterly focus is consistent with also state chartered and tax laws in terms of reporting. So if I were running a small business, I would certainly focus on quarterly results. And to think of the forecast that we're going to create as more of a business outlook for your company. And you can even lose the term forecast, call it an outlook if you wish. Does this mean that going forward, if we look at historical past performance, does that mean going forward you're only subject to the history of the company in terms of trend cycle seasonality? No, that's not what I'm espousing here. The business forecast that we're creating is really kind of a business as usual forecast, and I told you it's pro forma. And they're subject to change. You can implement programs as overlays on top of this forecast. That's what I expect you to do. I expect you to make decisions as a result of what you see in terms of the business as usual outlook. Okay, you can change the future. I'm not saying that you have to rely on the forecast as the only answer, but it does provide a baseline for you. What we're going to do is look at the process itself, and we're going to use a method called decomposition. It's in the second bullet up here, and it captures a trend cycle and seasonality. And you need at least 2 years of historical data, quarterly or monthly. If you can go back further than that, it's even better, because it strengthens kind of the calculation of the growth trend and cycle and seasonal effects. And we're going to use Microsoft decomposition, and I've got a 9-step procedure that will apply that'll simplify the generation of the forecast. You can still use quarterly or monthly. I've got examples of both. I'm not saying that you have to use quarterly data. You can use monthly as well, and I'll show you how to use both. If you want to use monthly and then use a quarterly forecast, you can derive both for your company if you wish. And so, as I mentioned, in most businesses, all the businesses I've been exposed to, which are those 3 Fortune 500 companies, the businesses' revenue is considered a driver for cost, operating expenses, cost of goods sold, or cost of revenue in some cases. That's the way it's determined, and interest and taxes and headcount. So it is really the driving factor behind any plan that you produce relative to expense levels. Here are the steps in the process. Collect company quarterly information, monthly or quarterly, or collect company information. Revenue. Develop seasonal view, and we'll do that. We'll use a 4-period moving average. This is the steps that we were talking about. I'll show you how to do that. We use moving average and then go to a centered moving average. We'll discuss that. I'll show you. And obtain trend for the deseasonalized view using the line plot. And the reason why I'm using a line plot instead of trend in Excel is because I want you to see the coefficient for the line plot. That is the slope term, because that'll give you an indication of your long-term growth in terms of dollars. And it'll give you an indication of what investors would look for in your company. We're going to develop the cycle factors, and that is how your firm reacts to changes in general economic conditions. And what we're going to do is create a deseasonalized view and use trend values and deseasonalized information to come up with these cycle factors. And we're going to develop seasonal factors by taking the deseasonalized forecast that we developed up here in step 2 with these averaging techniques, a moving average and centered moving average. We're going to use that information and deseasonalize the data and create a seasonal index for the company by dividing each period into the original data, each period's deseasonalized data into the original data. Then we're going to create a company seasonal index. We're going to get the average of those seasonal factors that we developed up to step 5 and create a seasonal index that will repeat year after year. So it's easy to estimate the future values of that seasonal index because they remain relatively constant for your company. And we multiply the trend values times the seasonal index times the cycle factors to create the forecast. So it's got all the components. It's got trend, seasonal index, and cycle factors in the forecast values. Okay? And then we're going to plot the forecast appended to company sales and check it for reasonableness and use a line plot function in Excel to do that. Now you say that's kind of difficult to do. Let me see if I can get down to my shrink this down. This is what I need. And this is what I was talking about in terms of the steps. All right. Let's say we've got quarterly data for your company. Okay. You can take this directly out of QuickBooks or whatever. If you can sum the months up to quarters if you wish and express your data in quarterly data. I've got some information back through 1996 for a company. You don't need to have that many observations. As I mentioned, you needed to have at least 2 years of observations. You can have more years than that if you want to reach back further. And I'm just showing you a reach back, a pretty good time period in the history of the company's revenue generation. Anyway, we put the oldest revenue at the top, and these are in millions of dollars. You can put them in thousands. It doesn't make any difference. Let's just say these are thousands. We'll just call them thousands of dollars. That's $5,335,000 made during that quarter, and $5,585,000, or $5,335,000. So it doesn't have to be in millions. It can be dollars. This is $5,000. All right. So we'll just say these revenue. This is for a company, small company, and has these dollars denominated in thousands. Okay. So we sum these. We don't sum them up yet. We just keep the quarters reporting. And if I can just get my hands out of this. I don't know why I did that. I need to hit the return on this. Okay. So we've got all the revenues expressed in dollars all the way down to the bottom. And let's say this 2004 is the most recent yours would go probably through third quarter of 2019. Okay? So your start point and stop point don't have to be the first period. You can start it at the third quarter or second quarter. You can end at the fifth quarter. It makes no difference. Okay? To the process. And we do something called a moving average. And that is you grab the quarters, the first 4 quarters, and do a moving average of those. Just sum them up. And here's the moving average. You average B2 to B5. That's what we do here. So just type in equals averages B2, parenthesis B2, colon B5, and then close parentheses. And what this does is that it averages these first 4 quarters, averages the first whole year, and puts the average just past the midpoint of the year. So I'm averaging January, first quarter, second, third, and fourth, getting the average of those periods and putting them over here. And you can use this function that I've got, and all you have to do is copy that function and then paste it down in these cells below it, and it'll calculate that moving average for you. It's simply done. Just put your cursor here after you've replaced these numbers with your numbers for quarterly information. Just go back and just simply copy this cell, and it'll paste the result in all the cells. Okay? So I've got the operation already programmed in. This is a little macro that we've got. It says the average is B2 through B5, so it's going to average these columns. So when you enter your data, make sure you enter at the top of the column. If you need to change the dates, go ahead and change the dates the way you wish. If you want to delete some of these, start at 2000, you could do that. Just delete cells, move them up, and if you need to just replace these revenue numbers with your revenue numbers, and these averages will change as a result. And then we have something called the centered moving average. Now what we're doing here is we're smoothing this data for seasonality. Okay, by the time we take these averages, this average has most of the seasonality removed. Any of the other variation we capture with this annual, we capture with the CMA, centered moving average. And all that does is it's the average of these first 2 periods, and then it replaces, that's placed here. The average of the next 2 periods is placed here. And that's what this says. This function puts in the average of the 2 moving averages and places the number in the appropriate position. So all of these calculations result in something called CMA, centered moving average, which is actually the deseasonalized information for your company. That is, it's got the seasonality completely removed, or the majority of it removed. Okay? Now, in order to get the seasonal factors, these things, we can take the seasonal data and divide it into the actual data. So we take the seasonally adjusted information, divide it into the actual data, and that gives us something called seasonal factors, column H. Okay? And this Excel spreadsheet will automatically calculate those seasonal factors for you once you enter in your revenue data and with the dates associated with it, right? The dates are non sequitur. They don't enter into this calculation. They're just there for your reference. Okay? So what you need to do is put your quarterly data in, delete the rest of the data. If you only have that many observations, just make sure that they begin at the top of the column. This could be 2003. First quarter, second, third, fourth, so forth, all the way up to third quarter of 2019 if you wanted to, and have the appropriate dates for each quarter put over here in this side. You can delete and add more dates to this if you wish. Just make sure that they correspond to the revenue that you put in. Okay? So you can make those adjustments, and it'll calculate the moving average and the deseasonalized or centered moving average for you. Now we can create an index and look at trend, and that's one of the reasons why you want the index, because it gives you a way to calculate the trend. You'll notice that E is used, this index column is used in the calculation of trend. It's one of the variables that's used. And you'll notice that there is an expression before E. And that's this is a trend equation that you have for your data. Let me tell you how you can get that. We can take the centered moving average information. If we put our cursor above D and go to Insert, should be able to do this. Let's see if we can. Insert a line chart, okay? And you can select that line chart. And it shows you a time series plot of the deseasonalized information that you had, okay? Okay. Let me go ahead and delete that. So we can create a plot of any of these columns and create a line chart for it. Let me do that again one more time for you. Go to Home. Excuse me. I'm really not demonstrating this well for you, am I? Let me do this one more time. CMA, Insert, line chart. And there we go. We've got the line chart. Okay? That's pretty easily done. Line chart again. And we can check on the let me see here. Format axis, we don't need to do that. Let's try again. I think we can select the function itself. Let's do that. Add trend line. Okay, so we've got a trend line added. You see this trend line? That is actually the data that's included in column F for your, and we can also add the, display the equation on the chart. You see this after trend line format, go all the way down and display equation on the chart. And when we select OK here, when we enter that, there's the equation that you see. Now what I wanted to do is show you what this trend represents. It's the points along this line for your data, beginning the data period that it starts with and goes all the way to the end, past the end of it. But look, the important thing is here, let me just make this bigger so you can see it. Now all we did is go to line chart and then selected the line itself and then added the trend line and then went to the trend line to enter the equation. And here's the equation that we see at the top right here. Let's see if we can expand this. I'm going to move it off the plot area probably to do that. Anyway, it's y is equal to 111.93x. I'm not getting this thing to behave correctly. I don't necessarily need to move it, but I guess I could. As long as you can read it, that's what counts. Okay, y is equal to 111.93x. X happens to be the index values that we've created. Okay? So what that means is, and each one of these index values represents a quarter change, right? First, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh. So this is the quarterly change in revenue for your company. It says that each quarter you would expect over the long haul, and that's reflected by the trend line, $111.93 change. That is, it would grow by $111.93. That's interesting information for you because it tells you, remember how all decisions are made on the margin? It tells you what you can expect is kind of a business as usual change in revenue is going to amount to about approximately that much, $111.93, okay, per period. And you can make investments or whatever you want to on it, but that is what's expected going forward. And that's going to change because we're going to add seasonality and cycle to it. But generally speaking, if I were an investor, this is how I would look at your company in terms of the growth. That is, it's going to grow by $111.93 per period. That's not very good for this company, of course, but this is in terms of a company that's got millions of dollars, but this could apply to you, and you need to find out what that is. That's why that line, that equation is important to you. This tells you for every period X, that's this index, for every period X you can expect 111.93 in terms of growth, okay? And you can do with that what you will. But that is part of this equation that we've got here. In terms of calculating, there's 111 times E4, which is a trend, or the index, E4, okay? And so the trend line is repeated here. Just put that equation, just enter it into this area, and it'll automatically calculate the trend value. And all you have to do is copy this, control copy this cell, and paste it down. Just color the whole, select the whole time series, and then paste that equation in, okay? And what that'll do is calculate the trend line values for your data and even past your data, okay? So wherever your data stops, just keep going past it all the way down to the end of the trend line, okay? Because we've got forecasts for the trend, don't we? All right. Hope I explained that well enough to you. We can go through it again if you wish, but what we're doing is taking the centered moving average information that we had, that's column D, after we did the two-stage differencing, or smoothing, averaging, 4-period moving average, or a 12-period if you've got quarterly, monthly. I'll get there in a minute. If you have monthly data, it's a 12-period moving average. And then you have a 2-period moving average of those moving averages. And that creates the deseasonalized data. And then we just put it in the index. We entered these numbers, put the index in, and then calculated the trend value, trend equation, by simply looking for a line plot, going to insert, when you get the CMA, insert the line plot. See that? And then we again selected the line plot function, Format the data points. Let me say add trend line. See this add trend line function here? That's what we did. Okay, and it opens this up, and then we check the display trend equation, and it pops up. Okay? See if I can delete all this stuff without destroying everything here. Okay, so we got the trend line that we've calculated from the equation. We put the equation in here, and it calculated the trend line for us. And then we get something called cycle factors. And that is the CMA divided by the trend line. And the trend line represents the long-term growth rate of the company. And the CMA has deseasonalized data, but it still has cycle in it. So we get these cycle factors. Everywhere its cycle factor is above 1, and that's simply a division function. See, D4 divided by F4. It's D4 divided by F4. And that function is already built into these cells. So you just, it calculates it, and you should just be able to replace these numbers, revenue numbers, and it'll recalculate this stuff for you. Then we get the seasonal factors. After you get the cycle factors, and you notice that the cycle will change. I've got a copy of the cycle factors in the time series plot here below. So these are the cycle factors. You know, everywhere they're above the line, the trend line, they're greater than 1. Everywhere they're below the trend line, it's less than 1. So the cycle factors will oscillate around the trend line. You get close to it, they're 1. Then we have the seasonal factors. Now these are important. I told you what we'll do with these seasonal factors is look at the deseasonalized data divided into the actual data, and it'll give you the seasonal factors. And this is what we have in the function up here. Then we'll create a seasonal index, which really adds up the seasonal factors for each quarter, like third quarter seasonal factors. It adds them all up and gets an average of those third quarter seasonal factors. You know, they're all a little bit different. And it'll get an average and place the average here. Do the same thing for the next quarter, the fourth quarter. It adds up all the fourth quarter seasonal factors, so it's over here. No, they're right here. Adds fourth quarter seasonal factors, adds them all up, and gets an average, and it puts it here in this quarter. So this is what you get is the average, and you're going to have to calculate this yourself. Please forgive me, but I don't know how much data you've got. You might not have as many in column H as we've got here, but you might have to delete some of these H's, these seasonal factors, if you don't have them already calculated. You know, you might not need all of these if you don't have that much data. So it'll calculate the seasonal factors for you, and you notice the seasonal factors repeat every 4 periods. And the seasonal factors will add up to 4. That's the number of quarters you have in a year. So you have this repeating quarterly information. Okay? And can you forecast what that repeating quarterly information is for seasonality? You certainly can. You can forecast that past the end of the data for the number of periods you want to forecast. Here we have 8 periods for forecasting, so we include 2 years' worth of seasonal factors. So it's worth mentioning that what I've got this set on is forecasting for 8 periods. So it develops the trend line, it develops the cycle factors for 8 periods. And notice the cycle factor I've got repeating for the 8 periods is the same. And that is, I don't know where the business is going to go. General economic conditions are going to take us. I'm just going to assume that it's going to be kind of the same thing that we have today. Okay? And I'll show you how you can change that. Okay? Okay, if you want to alter those cycle factors, for instance, if we're sitting right here for a cycle factor at this point, that's the last one. If when you plot them with the line plot, you can certainly do that. Go up, insert, and put the line plot. Insert, and just put your cursor above this column, this cycle factor column, and then go to insert line plot, and it'll create a line plot for you. Okay. We borrow the last cycle factor, and we say it's not going to change. That is, I'm going to assume that business cycle is going to remain kind of in the steady state recovery period that we had, and it's not going to change very much at all in the future. You can change this. For instance, if our last cycle factor were here on this line plot, we could borrow another cycle factor that turns down. We could borrow the next 8 cycle factors. It shows the economic downturn. Whatever you do, you should start the downturn. You could start this as a downturn that you see for an economic downturn. You could borrow these cycle factors, for instance. And what we're saying is that we're going to have a recession that's about half as large as the previous recession, and the recovery period is going to look like this. So what we're doing is really borrowing the cycle factors, the 8 cycle factors from the previous recession. And all you have to do is look up the point that we want on this chart. If I hover over it, it should tell me what the point is. But you can see it's probably around 20 or 19. So if I went to the cycle factor for 19, I could borrow from here and borrow the next 8 cycle factors, and that would reflect, and I could paste those down here, and that would reflect, a downturn in the economy. It would repeat this downturn at the end of your data. Okay, so we can change the cycle, business cycle effect on your company by borrowing some of the historical cycle factor effects that you've had. Oops. Okay, let me replace that if I can. All right, so if we want to get the forecast values, see this column J, for these forecast trend elements, multiply the trend times the cycle component times the seasonal index will give us the forecast value. Okay, that's simply F38G times G38 times I38, the seasonal index, and it'll give us the forecast values for our company, business as usual, based on historical seasonal indices. And if we run a time series plot of those data appended to the actual data that we've got for revenue, this is what we'll get. See the company forecast? It looks fairly reasonable, doesn't it, based on the historical values. So that's how these functions work in Excel. So all you have to do is replace these revenue numbers with your numbers to begin with, and then shift these dates around to match your dates that you for each of the revenue that you have, and you're in business. You can start doing this. Most of these functional cells will work because they're feeding off one another. Okay, so you can put your information in there. Let me show you another version of this, and that is the monthly version. Whoops, I went to the wrong one. The monthly version. So if you want to do this by months, this will calculate the monthly results for you. Okay? You got the data. Okay? Revenue data for the years. Get the standard moving average. You can see we lost some half the year due to the moving average. Then the standard moving average, seasonal factor, seasonal index, and you create the index that we've got, and the trend line and the cycle factors. So it's got the same calculation capability. Okay? So if you want to use monthly data, you can do that, or you can use quarterly data. So you've got an Excel worksheet for either one. And not only that, I'm giving you this little piece of information. It's an Excel spreadsheet where you simply plug in your information. You've got the year, the quarter of the year, and the sales information. You just plug in your data in this little function. You don't have to have all of them. You could plug in, I don't know how many observations you may have for your sales information or revenue information, and it'll automatically calculate the forecast for you. Okay? It'll calculate the revenue forecast, and it calculates the seasonal index for you, and the trend for future, the seasons, the trend, and it uses the last cycle factor that's calculated to create the revenue forecast itself. Okay? And you can certainly create a line plot of the sales forecast. And you can see in this case there's a lot of seasonality recurring in the company. That's the sales with revenue, with the seasonality built in it, forecast for the company. Okay? You got forecast numbers that would apply. I've got more than, and here these last forecast numbers. I only used 4 forecast periods in this template, so the last 4 periods of the forecast. Okay? So there's all sorts of stuff that you can look at. You can look at the deseasonalized data, and here's the trend line. And it says this company, whatever we got here, this is in millions of dollars, for instance, or thousands. Let's say it's thousands. This intercept or this quarterly value we have is in thousands of dollars too. So the expected growth rate for this company, based on the deseasonalized trend, is $1,856.20. This coefficient's always going to be in terms of whatever the revenue is in terms of. In this case, the sales column D. Okay? So that's the per period growth. And you notice the trend line goes through that. So that's the expected growth per period. So you can monitor the health of your company. You can change the growth by what? And increasing revenue through another program that you want to apply. But keep in mind that this is just a business as usual forecast. It's a foundation for the forecast for your company. And here's another clean template for you. Here's the quarterly forecast example again, and the monthly forecast template again. Okay? So this is the one that you could use to create your forecast as well. You can put your own sales information in here, and it'll calculate these values for you, and then calculate the forecast for you by quarter. Okay? All right. So, let's go back to where we were. So we went through the steps in the process, all the way from collecting your collecting your company data all the way through 9, plotting the data, plotting the forecast. And here are the instructions. I've got them written down for you. We'll create 10 columns A through J, and you'll see them on the spreadsheets that I've provided. And it shows you what's included in each column. Dates, company sales revenue, how the moving average is calculated, and how the centered moving average is calculated in column D. In column E, on those examples I showed you, shows a simple index. Okay. Column F is a trend, and I showed you about the index trend equation. Okay. Showed you how to get the cycle factors. That's dividing the centered moving average into the actual data that you have and that you entered in. How to calculate the seasonal factors. Okay, that's dividing the CMA, the centered moving average or deseasonalized data, into the original data. How to calculate the seasonal index, which is an average of these seasonal factors for each year, for each period, for each year, and get an average. It creates a seasonal index, and it repeats, that average repeats year after year. And then the company sales revenue forecast is simply the trend that we calculated in column F times the cycle factor in column G times the seasonal index in column I. And that gives you the company's revenue forecast. Okay? And you can plot that forecast just by appending the forecast values to the actual data and running a line plot in Excel. So you can use either the template we've got or the decomposition Excel model that we've created for you. And there again, it's a tried and true forecast technique. It usually yields fairly accurate or really accurate forecasts for business as usual conditions. Now what you need to do after you get that forecast is look for any programs you might want to overlay that you think would generate additional revenue. And you put those revenue estimates in addition to the revenue estimates that are created by the business as usual forecast. I want you to be very careful about program overlays on top of the planned forecast, revenue forecast, because in some cases programs will cannibalize existing revenue. So make sure that the revenue increment or the revenue addition you make is truly incremental, that program, for instance, if you introduce a new product, that it won't cannibalize any existing product and substitute for revenue that it's currently generating. So you just have to be careful about what that new program will do to the baseline revenue when you add it. Okay, then you get a program adjusted revenue forecast that is the basis for your plan. And let me tell you what we can do at Texas A&M University and the College of Business. We can help you run this model if you wish for your company, but without revealing any proprietary information. You don't even have to give us the revenue forecast. What you could share with us is the cycle factors, column G. And that is, we can tell you, if we have a history of your cycle factors, we can look at the history of cycle factors versus, for instance, the Texas GDP, gross domestic product, Texas expected gross domestic product. It's forecast for it. And we can estimate what your cycle factors might have to be going forward. Remember, I told you we could borrow some from the past, but we can tie the cycle factors in with the current Federal Reserve System forecast to determine whether or not you might want to reduce the cycle factor or increase it in your forecast estimation. So what we can do is go back, if I can, and help you adjust column G. This column relative to the forecast that you've got. Okay? So we can apply the latest and greatest forecast that the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, for instance, has into your company and give you cycle factors that you need to use going forward for the forecast. So you'd simply go back to the template that we had and replace those forecast cycle factors with the forecast that we would give you for the cycle factors for your company. And that's all you've shared with us is the cycle factor information. Okay? Nothing else. I don't think it requires we could sign a disclosure agreement with you, but I don't think it's really necessary in this case. And you come up with your own individual sales revenue forecast, right? Because your long-term growth, the trend line, and your seasonal effects are completely unknown to us at A&M. Just the cycle factors. Okay. You could use the Excel multiplicative decomposition template that we've given you. Just plug your data in. It's a colored template that you saw, and it'll do the forecast calculations for you. So we can provide you economic outlook in terms of what the cycle factors might be, what the Federal Reserve says of Dallas, and we can examine your historical cycle factors and provide you a tailored cycle factor projection to substitute for the constant cycle factor used in the forecast procedures that we've given you. Okay? So we can replace that constant cycle factor and recommend whether you introduce a recession and what quarter that might appear, quarter or month it might appear in. Here's a January 18th Fed forecast, for example. I haven't updated this slide recently, but it's still the same. It's no change. You see the forecast of Dallas federal jobs is remaining relatively constant. So it's going to, this line, if I included the most recent forecast, is going to remain relatively constant. And what we can do is tie the cycle factors for your company into the jobs forecast, the GDP forecast for the Dallas area. This jobs forecast is one that we can easily get to. And let me go back to that slide. And we could tie your company's cycle factors to the jobs, Dallas, Texas jobs, and the forecast would reflect, their jobs forecast for the Dallas Fed would reflect changes in the cycle. Okay? So we can tie your data, your cycle data, to economic information from the Dallas Fed, for example, either the jobs forecast or domestic product estimates. Okay? So that's what we can help you with. We can become your kind of economic advisor from the standpoint of the future cycle patterns. And this concludes my presentation of forecasting for small, mid-sized businesses in a rural environment. Okay? It includes, as I said, farms all the way up to firms that hire quite a few people and to have millions of dollars in monthly revenue. So just keep in mind that we're here to help you, and we'll, if you need our help in implementing the model, feel free to contact the Texas A&M College of Business, and you can refer to me directly if you wish. Stan Holmes at the College of Business, Department of Management and Economics at Texas A&M Commerce. And that concludes our presentation. Thank you.